something left. Food outside my shelter. On the second morning, I found food outside my shelter. The nearest road was 3 days away. My own food bag was untouched, and there wasn't a single track anywhere around it. 5 years later, I still don't know who left it there. I'm 44 years old. I've hunted the backcountry of western Montana for over 20 years. I'm not a man who sees things that aren't there. Ask my friends. I'm usually the one talking everyone else out of the spooky theory. The guy who finds the boring, practical answer and makes everybody feel a little silly for wondering in the first place. That's exactly why this story has never let go of me. I spent years trying to find the boring answer. I never did. This happened 5 years ago on a solo trip into a remote drainage in the Bitterroot-Selway country, the kind of place where help, if you need it, is measured in days, not hours. I'm going to walk you through this in order, because the order is the only thing that makes it make sense. And there's one detail near the end, something search and rescue found that never made it into any official report. That still bothers me more than anything else. Let's start at the beginning. The trip. 5 days alone in a drainage I'd never hunted before, well off any maintained trail. I filed a route with the ranger station, the way I always do, the same way every experienced person in that country does. I told my sister exactly where I was going and when to start worrying if she didn't hear from me. That habit has saved more than one careless friend of mine over the years, and I've never seen a reason to skip it myself, no matter how routine the trip felt going in. I packed conservatively. Food for the trip plus a margin, water treatment, a solid shelter system, a first aid kit I'd built up over years of trips like this one. I checked my gear twice before leaving, laid everything out, and went through it item by item. Small oversights become big problems 3 days from a road. The hike in took a full day, on an old trail that hadn't seen real maintenance in years. Deadfall across the path in places, sections where the trail nearly disappeared into brush entirely. I made camp that first evening near a creek, set up my shelter, and settled in for what I expected to be 5 unremarkable days. Good scouting, maybe a decent elk encounter if I got lucky. Unremarkable. That's exactly what it was, for about 18 hours. The first night ordinary, the way most first nights in the backcountry are. I cooked, ate, hung my food bag 200 yards from camp using a proper counterbalance method, the way every backcountry safety course teaches you to. I checked it myself before bed. Secure. I woke the next morning, and it was exactly where I'd left it. Untouched. Hold on to that detail. It's the whole reason this story exists. The second morning. The first full day of scouting went exactly as planned. Good vantage points over the drainage, fresh elk sign, getting a feel for terrain I'd never walked before. Nothing unusual at all. That matters for the credibility of everything that follows. It was exactly the kind of ordinary, productive day I'd hoped for. I came back that evening, ate, secured my food the same way, went to sleep with no reason to expect anything different. What I found when I woke up changed everything. Food, outside my shelter. Not mine. I checked immediately, and my hung bag was exactly where I'd left it. Untouched. Secure. This was different food entirely. A handful of huckleberries, a cleaned root vegetable, sitting on a flat rock a few feet from my shelter opening. Someone, or something, had placed food outside my shelter while I slept. 3 days from the nearest road. In a drainage so remote I hadn't seen another human footprint, another piece of trash, another sign of recent human presence anywhere on that first full day. My first thought was simple. Another hunter had passed through, seen my camp, left something as a small kindness. It's not common in that kind of remote country, but it happens often enough that experienced backcountry people know the gesture when they see it. That theory lasted about as long as it took me to look at the ground. The missing tracks. The soil around my shelter was soft from rain 2 days earlier, soft enough that my own boot prints from the night before were still sharp and clear. I'd walked that exact path a dozen times the day before. I knew exactly what my tracks looked like in that ground, because I was standing right on top of them. There were no other tracks. None. Not boots, not bare feet, not animal prints of any kind. And I know what deer, elk, bear, and coyote tracks look like in that substrate. I got down on my hands and knees and went over that ground inch by inch, the way you do when your mind keeps insisting there has to be an explanation if you just look hard enough. I widened the search to 30 feet, checking every patch of exposed soil. Nothing. No track leading to that rock, no track leading away from it. Just my own prints from the day before, and food that hadn't been there when I fell asleep. Food appearing is strange. Food appearing with zero physical evidence of how it got there is something else entirely. It doesn't just raise a question. It removes every easy answer before you've had a chance to consider one. I spent a long time that morning sitting with that absence, turning it over, the way you turn over a puzzle piece that doesn't seem to belong to any puzzle you recognize. I checked the one strip of exposed rock near the shelter, ground that wouldn't hold a print regardless of what crossed it. Nothing there either. No scuff, no disturbed lichen. Nothing to suggest it had been used as a deliberate, track-free path to my door. I ate the berries. Hunger and curiosity together are a powerful combination. And leaving good calories untouched 3 days from a road felt like the bigger risk. I didn't eat the root. Something about it made me cautious in a way the berries hadn't. So I packed it instead, carefully in a side pocket of my packs. That decision matters later. Remember it. The sounds that night I scouted the rest of that second day. Though my attention wasn't fully on elk sign anymore, I kept glancing back toward camp more than I needed to. Partway through the day, glassing a ridge a quarter mile out, I noticed something I almost dismissed entirely. A section of brush, maybe 10 feet across, flattened in a way that didn't match any deer or elk trail. Not narrow and consistent, the way a clean game trail runs. Wide. Messy. Like a single heavy pass had pushed straight through instead of following any established route. I logged it mentally, the way I'd logged everything else, and kept moving. That night, for the first time, I heard something that didn't belong to the wind or the creek. Heavy movement, beyond my fire. Slow. Deliberate. Long pauses between each sound. The kind of pacing that says, whatever's making it has no reason to hurry. I called out. Nothing answered. The movement stopped, resumed once, farther off, then went quiet entirely. I sat up a long while after that. Fire built higher than it needed to be, turning over the last 24 hours in a way I hadn't expected to be doing on a simple scouting trip. At the time, I thought that sound was the strangest part of the night. I was wrong. The first tree. The next morning, my third day, I expanded my search beyond camp, partly curiosity, partly because I needed to do something with the unease that had settled in overnight. I retraced the flattened brush from the day before, followed it as far as I could before it dissolved into ground, too rocky to hold sign. It led, roughly, in the same direction as the sounds I'd heard that night, which was enough to convince me the two were connected, even without proof. About 60 yards out, I found a young lodgepole pine, 6 inches across, snapped clean in half at almost exactly shoulder height. Deadfall breaks low, near the base, where the structural stress concentrates. This break was high, clean, the kind that suggests deliberate force, not gradual failure. 20 years in that country, and I'd seen plenty of bull elk thrash saplings during the rut. This didn't match. No surrounding damage. No wider disturbance you'd expect from a ruttin' bull working out aggression. Just one tree, snapped once, isolated. I logged it and kept moving, telling myself there was probably a mundane explanation I simply wasn't seeing yet. What I found 100 yards further made that explanation a lot harder to hold on to. The second tree. A second tree. Same diameter, same clean break, same unusual height. High enough I had to look up slightly to examine it myself, and I'm not a short man. 2 isolated breaks, 100 yards apart, with nothing in between. By this point, I'd stopped reaching for the elk rut theory entirely. A rutting bull leaves a wide pattern of disturbance, bent grass, churned dirt, multiple smaller branches stripped along with the main damage. This read as 2 discrete, deliberate actions, spaced along what was starting to look like a path. Someone, or something, had been using on purpose. I knelt at the base of that second tree for several minutes. The wood at the break was fresh, pale, recent, within a day or two, consistent with everything else that had happened since I'd arrived. No scat, no rub marks, none of the secondary sign that comes with animal damage. While I knelt there, I heard something else. A low, rhythmic sound, 3 or 4 beats, evenly spaced, coming from up the slope. Not a vocalization. More like something solid striking something else solid, deliberately. The kind of sound you'd make if you wanted to be heard without calling out. It stopped and didn't repeat, no matter how long I stood there listening for it again. I knew exactly what that sound was supposed to mean, if you've read enough about that range out of simple curiosity. I didn't take it seriously in the moment. I filed it away with everything else and kept going. Every part of me, built from 20 years of backcountry instinct, was telling me to turn back. The smart move, the move I would have told any client to make, was to walk away from a pattern this deliberate and let it stay a mystery. I didn't. I needed to know what was making this more than I needed to feel safe about not knowing. What I found at the end of that line is something I still haven't come to terms with. The clearing. The damage led to a small clearing, maybe 40 feet across, ringed by mature timber. It had the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty so much as held. The way a room feels different the moment after someone's left it, even if you can't say exactly how. The ground itself was wrong, disturbed in patches that didn't match any bedding pattern I knew. Not the oval depressions elk leave, not the messy sprawl of a bear's daybed. Something else. Flattened vegetation, irregular, scattered with no pattern I could assign to any known animal. I spent 20 minutes there before finding anything more specific than the general sense that something was off. Every instinct built over 20 years was telling me this was the kind of place a careful person leaves rather than investigates further. I found a third broken tree at the edge of the clearing. Same clean break. And along the surrounding timber, several patches of stripped bark. Nothing as dramatic as what I'd find a few minutes later, but enough to make me question what kind of animal could cause this much varied, deliberate-looking damage in one small area. The light was starting to shift. 2 hours, maybe, before I needed to get back. I made the call to head back and return the next morning with more daylight to work with. I hiked back slower than I'd hiked out, turning the morning over in my head the whole way. What I found back at camp. This detail happened that evening, and the order matters, because it's a separate piece of the puzzle, not just more of the same. My shelter looked different. A section of the outer cover, lashed down myself with paracord the first night, had been adjusted, not torn, not damaged, adjusted, in a way that actually improved how it sat against the wind. I hadn't touched it since securing it. The wind that day hadn't been strong enough to shift anything, and wind doesn't improve coverage anyway. It degrades it. I checked the ground immediately, the same careful inch-by-inch search I'd done the morning I found the food. Nothing. No tracks. No disturbed vegetation. No sign that anything had passed through, despite the fact that something clearly had. I went over that same ground 3 separate times that evening, certain I was simply missing something obvious, and found nothing different on the third pass than I had on the first. Whatever adjusted that cover had to approach close enough to physically work it into place with what I would only call competent hands, and then leave again without compressing a blade of grass or pressing a single print into ground soft enough to hold my own boots clearly the day before. I sat with that contradiction a long time that evening. The way you sit with a math problem you know has an answer you simply can't see yet. Something had been close enough to touch my shelter, study how it was built, and improve it, all while staying invisible to every method I had for detecting a physical presence. I didn't sleep well that third night either, though the sounds stayed distant. I told myself I'd return to the clearing one more time before deciding whether to cut the trip short. The return to the clearing. I went back at first light. Same path, past both broken trees, into that same disturbed clearing. It looked exactly the way I'd left it, which was almost more unsettling than finding it changed. Whatever caused this wasn't returning to that exact spot on a predictable schedule. Or if it was, I hadn't caught it. I stood at the edge of that clearing a while longer than I needed to, just looking. The way you look at a room you already searched once and suspect you missed something in. I worked the perimeter more carefully this time, the way you do when you already know roughly what you're looking for. Almost missed it entirely. The light was uneven, broken up by the canopy, and the first 10 minutes turned up nothing new. Then, kneeling at a patch of bare soil I'd already walked past twice, I found it. A partial track. Large. Far larger than any boot print I could attribute to a person. Nothing close to the deer, elk, or bear sign I'd documented constantly on that trip. It was smudged at the edges, hard to measure with full confidence. But the clear portion showed toe positioning and weight distribution that read unmistakably as bipedal. I photographed it, measured it against my own boot. the way you do when you need some kind of objective reference point for something your mind doesn't have a category for. And then I kept looking. What I found in the timber. At the edge of the clearing, in thicker timber, I found bark stripped from a mature fir in long, parallel lines, well above head height. 4 evenly spaced grooves, deep enough to expose bare wood in several places. I stood there a long time, the way you do when the cumulative weight of several small, individually explainable things finally tips over into something you can no longer talk yourself out of. The food, the missing tracks, the sounds, the broken trees leading straight to this clearing, the print. And now this. What I felt wasn't fear of an attack. It was something closer to the specific unease of realizing that whatever left that food without leaving a single track had almost certainly been watching me far more closely, for far longer, than I had any way of perceiving myself. Not from a distance, glancing over occasionally. Close, consistently. The entire time I thought I was alone out there. I'd seen enough. I headed back to camp, checking my surroundings more carefully than at any other point on the trip. What happened that final night is the part of this story I still struggle to put into words. The final night. I built my fire bigger than it needed to be, and decided, in those last hours of daylight, to cut the trip short by a day. Not purely fear. Continuing to scout a drainage with this much unexplained activity simply wasn't worth whatever marginal benefit I'd get from the final planned day. The sounds came back that night, closer than before, though never close enough for a clear visual. Same heavy, deliberate movement, same long pauses. Moving along what I came to think of, rightly or wrongly, as a rough perimeter around my camp, rather than a direct approach. At one point, well past midnight, I heard something I still can't categorize. Not quite a vocalization. Not quite movement. Something in between, low, brief, and it raised the hair on my arms in a way nothing else in that backcountry ever had. I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against a tree, fire built high, watching the tree line until first light. And that's when I found the last thing. The shelter. This is the piece of evidence that's made it hardest for me to accept any mundane explanation, even 5 years later. At some point that night, while my full attention was fixed on the tree line, my shelter had been altered again. I hadn't noticed it happening. That's how completely my focus had narrowed onto the sounds, instead of the structure right behind me. A section of the outer cover had been reinforced further. New branches, woven into the existing frame, improve on coverage along the same side as before. I didn't do this. I'd been awake by the fire the entire time it would have taken. I sat there in the gray light, staring at branches I hadn't placed, woven into a structure I'd built myself, and understood, with a certainty that's never fully left me, that whatever moved around my camp had come close enough to physically alter my shelter a second time, while I sat 20 feet away, fully awake, watching the wrong direction entirely. Twice now, it had been close enough to touch the place where I slept, and twice now, I had felt absolutely nothing to warn me it was there. I packed up at first light and started the hike out, a day ahead of schedule, checking my surroundings more carefully than I ever had in my life. The hike out. Nothing else happened that I could point to directly. But uneventful didn't feel the same as it had on the way in. I was listening differently, watching the tree line differently. carrying an awareness I hadn't had 3 days earlier. The kind that doesn't switch off just because the immediate danger, whatever it actually was, seemed to be behind me. I made it to my truck a full day before my sister expected to hear from me, which meant nobody had reason to worry yet, and meant, for those first hours of driving, I had nobody to tell any of this to but myself, replaying every detail against the windshield in the dark. I called the ranger station that evening, partly obligation, flagging unusual activity for other travelers. Partly because I needed to say it out loud to someone official, even knowing exactly how it would sound. The ranger station. The ranger was professional, patient, genuinely curious rather than dismissive. I described all of it in order: the food, the missing tracks, the broken trees, the partial print, the sounds, the altered shelter. He documented everything, asking specific questions about substrate, weather, exact dimensions. The kind of careful, methodical questioning that told me he was treating this as a real record, whatever his personal opinion underneath it. Near the end, he told me something I've thought about often since. My report wasn't the first one he'd taken describing something similar in that drainage. He was careful, professionally careful, not to characterize what those other reports concluded. He said it plainly, without drama, then went back to the paperwork, the way you'd mention any other piece of administrative context. I didn't push him for more. I've regretted that more than once since. What Search and Rescue later noticed, 3 weeks later, out of curiosity and a nagging feeling I couldn't set down, I called back to ask if anyone had returned to that drainage. A search and rescue training exercise, scheduled for an unrelated reason, had passed through that same area roughly 10 days after I'd hiked out. I was told, somewhat reluctantly, that the team had noted several broken trees matching my description, along with a section of stripped bark on a mature fir that one member photographed out of simple professional curiosity. Those photographs were never formally analyzed by anyone with relevant expertise, as far as I know. They sit in an internal file somewhere, attached to a report about a different exercise entirely. I never saw them myself. I'm relying on what the ranger told me secondhand, itself secondhand, from whoever briefed him. I offer that caveat honestly. The root vegetable. Remember the root I packed instead of eating? When I finally had it identified by a former biology teacher I knew through a mutual friend, the answer wasn't what I expected. It was a wild edible root that does grow in that region, technically safe, nothing dangerous. But the way it had been cleaned was unusual, not torn or bitten the way an animal foraging would handle it, leaving ragged material and embedded dirt. Cleaned carefully, deliberately. Dirt removed almost entirely from the surface, in a way she associated more with human food preparation than anything she'd seen an animal do to a root in the wild. I can't independently verify her assessment beyond trusting her expertise and her complete lack of reason to exaggerate a detail for a story she had no stake in. But of everything in this story, that single observation, how cleanly a root had been cleaned, has unsettled me more consistently than almost anything else. It's such a small, domestic detail to come out of a drainage that deep in the backcountry. It doesn't read like an animal's mistake. It reads like care. The detail I've never told anyone until now. I promised you the strangest detail would come last, the one piece that never made it into any official report. About a year later, a different search and rescue volunteer reached out to me directly, on his own initiative, after hearing a second-hand version of my story through colleagues. During an unrelated call-out in that same drainage, responding to a medical emergency involving a different hiking party, his team had come across a small, deliberate arrangement of stones near a creek crossing, roughly 2 miles from my old camp. Not a cairn, not a trail marker. Nothing matching any way-marking system he'd ever been trained to recognize. Just something carefully arranged, in a spot with no obvious reason for anyone to mark it at all. He photographed it on his personal phone, out of curiosity rather than protocol, and sent it to me during our conversation. I still have it. I've shown it to exactly 2 people, and neither one has given me an explanation that fully satisfies me. I have no way of connecting that arrangement to what happened to me a year earlier, beyond rough geography and my own unresolved curiosity. But I think about that photograph more than I'd like to admit, the same way I still think about how completely something moved through that drainage without ever once needing to be seen. Why I'm telling you this now. I've held every conventional explanation up against my own memory more times than I can count, and a responsible account has to take those explanations seriously rather than dismissing them for the sake of a better story. It's possible another hiker left that food as backcountry kindness, careful enough not to leave tracks in conditions I'm misremembering. It's possible the trees had mundane causes I failed to identify, despite 20 years of experience that should have made me better at recognizing ordinary damage. It's possible the print belonged to an unusually large animal, distorted by substrate conditions I didn't account for. It's possible the sounds were simply something I couldn't identify by ear alone, in country dense enough to make confident identification difficult, even for someone with my experience. I take all of that seriously. A story like this one loses something the moment it sounds more certain than the person who actually lived it. But I also know, with a confidence 5 years hasn't worn down, that I searched that ground myself, carefully, in good light, in soil soft enough to hold a clear print, and found nothing connecting that food to any visible approach or departure. I know my shelter was altered twice while I sat feet away, fully awake, watching the wrong direction. I know a search and rescue team independently documented damage matching my own description without any prompting from me. And I know that root had been cleaned in a way that read, to someone with real expertise, as deliberate rather than incidental. None of those facts, on their own, prove anything. Together, they're the reason I still can't put this story down 5 years later, no matter how many times I've tried. I don't know who or what left that food outside my shelter, 3 days from the nearest road, without a single track to explain how it got there. I only know it had every opportunity to do something other than feed me. It could have stayed hidden entirely, the way it clearly knew how to do. It could have ignored me the way every other unseen thing in that drainage seemed content to do. It chose not to. I still don't know why.